Mark your calendars, people. February 17th, 2022, Warhammer 3 is coming to a storefront near you. And besides the standard Steam and Epic Store releases, it's also coming to Game Pass for PC, which means potentially tens of thousands more players jumping into Total War for the first time. All that is awesome news, but I want to turn your attention to the Game 3 map, which was showed off pretty much in totality when the Ogres made waves on Thursday. Yes, you heard that right. Creative Assembly has confirmed the limited edition poster is essentially the entire map for Warhammer 3's campaign, which has left some people disappointed, some people very excited, and some people a bit clueless as to what the hell they're looking at. So what I want to do today is give my thoughts and impressions, clear up some possible misconceptions, talk about what I like, what I'm concerned about, and just have a discussion about how this playing space will impact our campaigns once it goes live in only a few short months. I want to give a big shout out to Axios Zyphos, Dark Chozo, Hazard, Lord Solar Macarius, Business Clam, and anyone else I might have missed for trying to give people a better understanding of how things are going down on this map. Of course, I'll add some of my own bells and whistles to hopefully make stuff easier to understand. For obvious reasons, it's likely not what you were expecting, right? Instead of getting a standard cardinal direction style map with west to the left, east to the right, north at the top, south at the bottom, a la something like this, we'll be looking at a heavily bent and warped playing space compared to what we're used to seeing, which makes some sense, because this time around the map is partially attempting to emulate a globe, with the North Pole at the focal point around which the other landmasses interact, as it were. It's clearly distorted, but that's partially because we're used to seeing simple Mercator projections, which themselves are somewhat notorious for warping the size of countries and geographical landmarks as you move closer to the poles. Basically, lines of longitude run vertically from north to south pole and converge at each point, but they appear parallel on a Mercator projection. So that's why landmasses such as Greenland and Antarctica appear way larger than they actually are compared to locations closer to the equator. It's also important for me to note here that these types of distortions are nothing new to the Warhammer trilogy, and in fact, both the Vortex map and Mortal Empires took some pretty crazy liberties with the locations of continents, their proximity to other landmarks, and their relative sizes in general. Ulthuan and its proximity to the coast of Bretonnia in Mortal Empires, for example, should be separated by an ocean, but instead your boy could swim across the channel, it's so tiny. And I am not a good swimmer. And even more egregious, of course, is its relationship with the Southlands in the Great Vortex map, where it should be hundreds of miles to the west of where it currently is, instead of being directly north of the Southlands. Changes like that will be made on all 5 campaign maps for this trilogy, the Mortal Empires versions and the standalone versions, just to try and make them all work. Now, Creative Assembly has described the Warhammer 3 map as being roughly twice the size of the Vortex campaign, which is a phrase that could be interpreted any number of ways, and kind of hard to know how much of that is marketing speak and how much of that is just basic fact. Obviously, a map like this one comparing the size of the 2 games could be incorrect, because we currently have an incomplete picture, but if you look at things purely based on the borderlines separating factions and the size of the text for provinces and compare those, Warhammer 3's map is bigger than the Vortex map by about 25% width and height, and easily has twice the land area, because the Vortex is literally half ocean. That was, I think, one of the biggest complaints people had about Game 2. In a game without naval battles, much of it was ocean. So at least for me personally, I'm not too worried about size here, because if the reality matches what we're seeing here, this map is titanic. Way less ocean, and way more playing space in general. It's going to be a good combination. And finally, for the first time, we have actual confirmation that the Realms of Chaos are a physical location that we can interact with outside of quest battles and survival battles. Something I think a lot of us took for granted. That was not guaranteed. Could have easily been quest chain or specific bespoke battles without any ability to march armies or explore there on the campaign map whatsoever. You'll notice that the Realms of the Dark Gods are surrounded by some kind of miasma on this map, and I do need to point out that all that blue space around the islands, that's not water. It's the ether, it's the warp, it's the stuff of magic, and there's no land bridges leading directly to these realms. So there might be certain objectives you have to complete to open up portals in order to access them, rather than just marching or sailing there. But that is not water. You're not going to jump on a boat and sail over to the islands there. The North Pole is a solid landmass. This isn't even really the North Pole. It's more like the border between worlds. So obviously there's an element to it that's kind of confusing to look at, but don't think of that as water. Think of it as you're going to have to do something specific to to make it over to those lands, and it will probably play a large part in the campaign and your objectives. I do love the idea of being able to attack the realms of chaos though, even if to do so would be folly in a real lore scenario. But it needs to be a late game gambit to end their threat for good, one that should be exceedingly challenging to complete and require a bunch of objectives completed before you can even attempt to do it. Not the type of invasion where you can just kind of stroll in with a few armies and wipe them off the map in maybe 5 or 6 turns. Not like that. I know some lore grognards here are probably cringing at the idea, but there is literally no point in having these on the map in the first place if you can't invade them. And it's a bunch of assets and wasted resources and visual splendor we don't get to experience if we can't march through the Brass Citadel or the Mansion of the Plague Lord or the Crystal Labyrinth with our own armies. Plus, the endgame of Warhammer 3 is likely to deviate from the narrative somewhat anyway, and that we'll be able to make a bid to truly end the chaos on their own home turf. So yes, from a lore perspective, you'd be met with an endless tide of millions of demons and die a horrible death, and you'd have zero chance of success, but this is Total War. It's a video game first and foremost. I think rule of cool prevails here. We just don't know exactly how all that will work yet. Cool thing I noticed on the map reveal though, the Dark Prince's realm is ringed by 6 concentric circles of seduction, representing avidity, gluttony, carnality, paramountcy, vainglory, and indolency. So nice little touch there from the lore, and an expedition force to defeat armies through each of those 6 circles would be a fitting way to temporarily rid the world of Slaanesh. As for the Chaos Waste further south, it's interesting to me that the western edges appear to be so much more fleshed out than the eastern edges north of Cathay, despite the fact that Cathay is playing such a large part in the campaign and has obviously been a huge part of the marketing cycle in general. If you take a look at the wastes above Norska, there are just way more provinces and playing space in the eastern steppes above the Great Bastion. There's just a lot more detail there. That's in part due to the fact that Games Workshop invested much more time creating those areas on official maps. It's an example right here. This is the western side of the Chaos Wastes, the parts north of the Empire and Norska, and it's clearly much more fleshed out than the eastern steppes and the stuff north of Cathay, but that likely has some implications in terms of future content as well. And I think this is some of your guys' biggest criticisms of this particular map, that in general, the western side, which includes some areas like the Empire that we've already had in 2 full games, appears better represented than the eastern side. We can point to the scrunched up red wastes and steppes that on a normal map look incredibly vast and expansive, but here look almost tiny north of Cathay. Certainly makes it more difficult for a Hobgoblin Khanate faction to make an appearance at some point, and even for Cathay itself, we're lacking the coastline to the far east, the ocean out there that would allow Dark Elves to circumnavigate the globe and raid from the sea with their black arcs, and we're lacking the southern edges of Cathay as well, where the Monkey King could march from the Mountains of Heaven and severely mess with Li Dao, the Fire Dragon, and the bottom borders of the realm. It does feel like there's been some disconnect between all the awesome lore blurbs we got about Cathay and their reveals from Andy Hall and the reality of the map itself, because as it stands currently, I'm not sure Li Dao, the Monkey King, or Ying Yen, the Sea Dragon, have their starting provinces even present on this map. The port city of Fuchao that Ying Yen rules is not on the map right now, and Nippon, Koresh, and Ind aren't on the map either, which is certainly a blow to their chances too. With that said, there's clearly a lot we don't know here, so certainly no reason to panic until we have a clearer picture. And I have to point out that those fogged out areas outside the playing space we've seen in every other campaign would obviously not be included in a limited edition promo poster. Think about the Darklands of Nehekara, Pigbarter, the Haunted Forest, the Dragon Isles. All these locations in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 that were caught up in the fog of war for ages, sometimes for years. We're clearly not going to see those types of edges on a promotional sheet of paper, and that will give us a much better idea of where CA might be planning to expand the map later. That's something that we'll only see once we actually get in-game. So while this poster is certainly useful for giving us an overview of what to expect, it doesn't give us the whole picture, and I would bet you there will probably be some fogged out stuff. Not to mention, we shouldn't be counting out their ability to add more landmass and updates anyway, even if those fogged out areas don't exist on day one. Which doesn't mean they'd create content like that often, or they would develop huge tracts of land each new patch, but I think people get stuck in the mindset that just because a developer hasn't done something in the past, that they can't do something in the future. Which has kind of been my frustration talking to some of you guys about the potential for 40k Total War. It's been 4.5 years since the last Warhammer title. Stuff does get better over time. People used to think end turn times would never be fixed. They used to think Cathay and Vampire Coast could never happen. They used to think all sorts of things, and a lot of the time they just ended up being incorrect. Technology changes. It evolves. Developers iterate and find new ways to do things, especially over the course of 3, 4, 5 years. So even if those fogged out areas aren't around on launch day, that doesn't necessarily mean that more can't be added at a later date. Just keep that in mind. I will say though, I am totally on board with you guys who wanted to see more of Cathay and the Eastern Steppes. It does appear smaller than what I would have expected initially, and I certainly hope it can be further fleshed out moving forward. I was never expecting a globe, but having access to the Eastern Sea to interact with the High Elf colonies on the Lost Isles of Elithis and to potentially teleport to the west coast of Naggaroth in an imitation of circumnavigation would have been really cool, and I honestly think that will be an important element of the Game 3 map. You want to be able to interact with the Dark Elves and Cathay if you're on the far side of the globe, right? If it's a situation where you never get to see Malekith, you never get to see Morathi, or never get to invade the Lizardmen as Cathay because you're just separated by a massive map that you should be able to sail around on, that would be a massive disappointment. So I'm hoping for a situation where you can teleport, hit up an area similar to the anchor points you saw on the Shogun 2 islands, those trade hubs where you could park a navy. I'd like to see a similar feature here, that once you've been there for say 2 or 3 full turns, the army then teleports to the other end of the map, off the west coast of Naggaroth or Lustria, and lets you begin your invasion proper. So hopefully that's content we will see in Immortal Empires. I think my ultimate point on the Cathay front is they're undoubtedly going to get plenty of extra content in terms of DLC and free DLC. I'm not worried about that at all. So I feel fairly confident that some combination of the Monkey King, the Fire Dragon, and the Sea Dragon will come, and it would be logical to include some small map expansions when that happens. As for the Chaos Dwarfs and the Darklands, I think this might be the most surprising element out of the entire reveal, besides the Realms of Chaos showing up. The home of the Dawi Zar is very compressed, and even with what might very well be a Titanic map, there's not a ton of space for their empire, at least compared to the massive wastelands we're used to seeing on traditional Warhammer maps. It's not that it's small, because it's fairly comparable to the Empire in Cathay in terms of size and in terms of playing space. It just had some serious fat trimmed off of it, and those vast expanses between cities were shrunk down significantly. It looks way smaller than it would on a traditional Warhammer map. So not small in terms of playing space, but definitely small compared to a Mercator projection of the Warhammer world. I think CA's noticed how much of the Game 3 world is a blasted wasteland though, and wastelands and water aren't particularly fun areas to interact with in campaign. So just like the ocean between Ulthuan and Bretonnia, they cut down the travel time it would take a marching army to cross the Dawi Zar Empire, which to be fair, would have been kind of an absurd amount of time, not really doing anything if it had been made like those standard Mercator projections we're used to seeing. There are like 5 important cities in the Darklands total. The rest is, as we just said, wasteland. So I think it makes some sense, but I can see why if you're a massive Dawi Zar fan, you'd like to see as much of their empire as possible. Finally, the last thing that sticks out to me on this map is the empire proper, with both Midland, Reichland, and the capital of Altdorf all making an appearance, which means Toddy and Emperor Karl Franz will likely be saying hello. Maybe the first time ever, cross-game lords will be making an immediate appearance before the combined campaign, which leads me to believe that Midland and a Cult of Ulrich expansion may very well be on the agenda. Considering CA have told us as much, that Toddy will have his day, maybe not a huge surprise there, but certainly adds more fuel to the fire, and if you're an Empire fan, I think that's pretty good news for you. I would also expect a cross-game Lord pack between Nurgle and Nuln at some point, because Zanbaijin, the Fallen City, and Kadatha are on the map for Tamarkan the Maggot Lord, and Elspeth von Draken will want to dominate his invasion with her Great Carmine Dragon and Winds of Shyish. Now, this was just an initial reveal. There's a ton of information we simply don't have access to at the moment, so like I said, no real reason to panic right now if you're one of those people that isn't a fan of the map, and if you are a fan of the map, you wouldn't be panicking anyway. But if it's as big as it appears to be, and has significantly more landmass and playing space than the Vortex campaign as it appears to, it's hard for me to feel disappointed by what we have here. It looks like it's gonna be really fun. We get to see the Realms of Chaos in all their glory. We get to march from the Empire to Cathay and conquer everything in between, and we get to see huge swaths of areas that have never been shown off in a video game before. I think there's certainly some elements to question and ponder about, but I think a lot of those will be answered when we get to see the game, or the map in-game for the first time, which may not be a long wait at this point. Really only two things I want from maps now. I want to see what it looks like in-game to get a better understanding of the scope and scale of it, and I want to see Immortal Empires, which will probably only become playable many months after initial launch, and we may not even see an overview of it until close to or even after February 17th. But for a lot of people, that combined campaign, which represents the culmination of all this hard work and the crazy scope of this trilogy, it's gonna make or break the franchise. I'd argue the combined Game 3 map will be the most important reveal for this trilogy, because it's the conclusion for everything, so hopefully CA can stick the landing there. Expectations will be rightfully huge. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this look at the Warhammer 3 map. Lots more content coming, and I'll see you all in the next video. Indie Pride, signing out for now. Have a good one, guys.